unending desire to try to figure out ways of outthinking my opponents, which is what I spend most of my time doing. And one of the ways of doing it is I like to go and look at very old stuff that's dusty, stuff that's old, stuff that people don't think is valuable anymore, and I try to think of ways of using that to apply that to debate. Trying to find things that I can maybe attempt to get something good out of. So, take one of these, pass it around. And this is something you can take home from all the stuff I'm going to say today. Here you go. And although debate might be new to you, or you might think debate is pretty new, and we haven't been doing it for a long time, you'd be surprised to know that for thousands and thousands of years people have studied debate. They may not have just studied it formally the way that we do, like in BP with the rules and things, but people have studied it for many, many thousands of years under the title of rhetoric. Right? Rhetoric being a derived word from the Greek word for an orator. Right? So what I've tried to do is put together some suggestions of things that I think are very, very valuable to think about from the classical Greek tradition and Roman tradition of how to induce people to do things if all you have are your words. And that's pretty much it. So rhetoric, being the study of inducement, eventually became the study of, in more modern times, of how to make words pretty, how to make things that you say pretty. So the very first thing on the handout is I have some figures here that I think can help with differentiating yourself from other teams or other debaters that you might come in contact with and people that you might argue against. Now, figures have traditionally been thought of as things that you do to make your words beautiful. But in this case, I think that what they do is they argue, they present, they educate, they make us see things differently and see things anew. So I put 5 figures on the front, but if you went and looked up figures on Google, you would find that there's many, many hundreds of them. I just picked 5 different ones. There's strategies you can memorize about how to put words together that make them mean different things or have different senses for stuff. So we can go over those first and talk about them. So one of the very first ones is anti-metaboly, which is basically a structure of parallelism where you say X is Y, Y is X. And I have a couple of examples right there. What is honest is to be treasured, and what we treasure is honesty. I do not live to fight, I fight for life. So it's where you take the 2 things that you're arguing about, right? 2 things that you want to structure a statement about. Let me put this up here. I'm going to figure out how to work the marker. Right? X and Y. These are the 2 things, and then you speak about one in some relationship with the other, right? Whatever that relationship might be, equal to, greater than, less than. Then you take this one, put it here, and then do the same thing. It's sort of a nice way of summarizing, or providing another perspective of the thing that you're trying to get people to believe in your speech. Right? One of the things that is very difficult is after you've figured out how to make arguments, how to put arguments together, how to structure arguments, is how to make those arguments new and fresh without repeating yourself all the time. Right? And that's what figures do for you. They help you say things anew. And by saying something new, you might be able to get the adjudicator to actually believe what you're saying. Wow, you say no, that couldn't be possible. Oh, it is, right? But you're just not saying it maybe in the right way. So what you can do with these figures is you can use them as ways of restating your argument or explaining it in a different way. Like in the basic sort of argument structure, which you guys are probably all familiar with. Is you make your claim, right? You explain it. You offer some proof. And then you offer an implication. Right? And that's how every argument should be structured in a basic sense. Right? An implication being, well, why does this argument matter for the debate? Why does it matter for the motion? Why does it matter for the round? Why does it matter for whatever it is that you want to tie it? What a figure can be is a part of your explanation. To make it clear, this claim might be incredibly obvious to you and your partner, but it might not be so obvious when you go out to say it. And so figures, practicing with the figures, help you make it very clear. Right? Because in your head, here's you, right? In your head, you might be totally, we've all had this experience. You're like, I have the perfect argument. Here it is. It's like a triangle. Then you go to say it, and you get like something like this. And you're like, why didn't the judge vote for me? I know what I said. Why didn't the judge vote for me? And so this disconnect is something that figures are supposed to help with, right? Okay, so the next one is the hyperbaton. Now, hyperbaton is when you change normal word order. You speak grammatically incorrect for a point, right? The normal word order. You put all the adjectives together instead of with the words that they're supposed to modify, or you put the negative at the end. So one of the great examples of recent American pop culture, oh yeah, that's a really good argument. Not, right? I mean, of course you wouldn't want to do that, like in a debate, but it just gives you an example of how to do it. Or a government honest and true we could support. Instead of we could support a government that is honest and true, which is sort of the vanilla way of saying it. You kind of mix those things up in order to make it sound very good, right? So you can think about creatively flipping some of the word order around in order to make that make sense. Enalage is an intentionally wrong word usage. Like, they just ain't gonna get it, right? Or one of the favorite ones is, that just ain't gonna cut it, right? It just ain't gonna happen, right? Where you kind of sound, this is sort of a trope that, a trope is another way of talking about figures, but it's sort of a trope in, at least in American legal practice, of the simple country lawyer. I don't know if you guys have ever run into this, but it's sort of a thing you see in American movies where there's this lawyer who's like, now, I'm not a very smart man. I come from the country, and I only know a few things about life. I know the value of a hard day's work. I know how to raise a chicken, and I know how much tractor parts should cost. And that's about it. I don't know much about your laws or justice or any of your highfalutin things, but I do know what's fair. And what's fair is that my client should be paid $200 million for spilling coffee on herself that was too hot, or something like that, right? It's made fun of all the time in American pop culture, of this sort of, what appeals to people is somebody who is a sort of a very simple person, because we tend to like to think that, so you want to adjust your language to suit the situation. So that's sort of a trope that's kind of related to it, is you adjust your language to suit the situation, right? And you can change the word order and things like that. And the point of all these, though, I should say, is that I don't want you to do these. Like, if we are in a practice debate and you're like, oh, it's the guy who did the handout, I better try some of these. These are only things that you should stick in your back pocket as like tools to use when the time is right. Because the point of all of this is to increase the understanding of the judge. So if the judge doesn't understand you and you have a great argument, you might as well not have a great argument, is the way I see it. So these are ways of sort of rephrasing that can help make it really stick. So using the incorrect word usage, them's fighting words, using the wrong subject-verb agreement, can be very, very effective. Right? Okay, the next one is something that's really actually kind of a fun one to do and very effective, which is a pretertio, right? And a pretertio is making an argument by passing over it. So the way you do this is you say, you know, they might expect us to talk about, you know, civil rights and justice and how horrible this plan is going to be, how it's really going to hurt the little guy, but we're not going to deal with those arguments right now. Right? Now, what have you just done? Right? You've sort of pointed them out and shown the judge what? What have you done?
You're showing them that you know the argument, they should be it. You say also believe they're also important.
Yeah, exactly. So you've shown the judge the most important thing, which is you're on top of the debate. You understand the arguments, you know exactly what needs to be talked about, but you actually have better ones. You think those arguments are not so good. So you've sort of shown everyone that you're plugged in to the issues and that those issues are important, but actually you think you have better arguments. So in this way, you actually get to cover those things. No one can say that you didn't cover them, right? Instead of just ignoring them or leaving them to the side. So it's a really, really great way of doing it, and I gave you a couple of examples about that.
You should still be sure that actually the arguments you're then going to use are strong.
Yes.
Otherwise,
yeah,
you're
absolutely.
going to say, well, you talked about civil liberties and you could have elaborated on that. That would have won you the debate, but now you were just talking random stuff.
Right,
Sorry, you lose, right? So it's dangerous.
Always make sure that your arguments are actually good. This is a good so these don't replace any arguments. I think that's a really good point. You do want to make sure the arguments you're going to use are good, but let's say that they have sort of set up, like let's say your first opposition, the government sort of set up, and is clearly pointing a direction where opposition ought to be going. They're like, oh, they're going to tell you on the side of the house this and that, da-da-da-da-da. You can use this as a way of sort of dealing with that instead of falling into the trap, right? So you can say, well, you know, they've mentioned that we're going to talk about this, this, and this. And of course we agree that these things are really terrible and awful and very saddening, but we're going to move past those things. So in a way you've actually kind of made it without making it. But if it's a really good argument, spend a lot of time on it. Don't just put it in this and be like, yeah, our best argument. Well, no, we're not going to talk about that. We're actually going to talk about a bunch of little arguments instead. Okay, and then the last one is anaphora, which is where you use the same phrase to get a number of clauses, and this sort of amplifies the power of the argument that you are going to make. So if you want to say this proposal is a bad one because this proposal leads to suffering, this proposal leads to expenses, this proposal leads to all kinds of problems, but the one thing this proposal won't lead to is a solution to this problem. So it's sort of an amplification strategy where you use the same phrase over and over again, bringing it up and bringing it up and bringing it up to a climax, and then you're done. So it's a nice way of sort of extending and coming up with more things to say, filling your time, and being able to offer those things in a different perspective. Instead of just sort of saying, well, you know, we think the proposal is bad because it hurts people. What we've told you today is, you know, instead of doing that, you could do it in a much more creative or artistic way and really get into sort of doing some persuasive speaking and really getting sort of into making it interesting for the judge to hear instead of just providing the facts. Right? Providing it in sort of a creative form in a nice package that they want to take with them. Right? So if these are only 5 figures that I managed to find that I thought were useful, but there's just a ton of them. So if you get interested in this, you can go look them up, and there's just so many of them. You could spend your whole life studying them. I don't know why you would, but some people do study those kind of things. All right, on page 2 is one of the most important things I think that debaters forget that we can learn from classical rhetoric, which is that rhetoric is about what is probable, and so is debate is about what is probably going to happen, right? And that is a distinction between what sort of gets trumped up as to what debate is about. And it's a distinction that I think is worth thinking about. So we have these 2 words in English that we throw around a lot. What is evidence and what is proof? Do you think there's a distinction between those things? Or do you think they mean the same thing?
Evidence is supporting argument, but proof is more definite. It shows exactly that it's true, like it shows categorically that it's true.
So this is support, and this would be what? What would be a keyword you'd say? If you say, well, evidence supports your argument, but proof does what? What would you say? Yeah, well, without being circular, which we'll get to in a minute. That's good, we're going to remember that from when we get to fallacies. But when we support, we might want to say the proof sort of maybe closes it. Right? So evidence supports, but proof is the thing that shuts it. Right? We could say that. What else? What do you see as the distinction between these 2 thoughts or words or ideas or concepts? I mean, you might think that they're the same thing, which is what most people think, right? They would put an equal sign here and be like, oh, it's the same thing. Right? But it might not be, is what I'm suggesting. What do you guys think? Anyone have any other ideas?
You can have evidence but no proof, but you can have no proof without no evidence.
Okay, so could you maybe explain that without being... I mean, that's a nice anti-metabolity, right? But...
basically, essentially, it's saying that you need the evidence to come up with a proof. But you do not have the proof itself can exist without the evidence, whereas, or rather, the evidence exists without the proof, but you need. I'm saying the same thing.
But
every time.
you can't prove anything without evidence.
Okay, so you can't have a proof without any evidence. So we would say this is maybe primary. And this is what, secondary? Like you would need to have some kind of evidence in order to establish some kind of proof. Right? Right? And if we think of, well, before I get into that, I'm trying to jump the gun here, I'm getting excited. So what other things? What else can you say? I don't want to launch off into talking without your other thoughts about it. What would you say? If someone says, I have evidence that you did this, I have proof that you did this. What is the difference then? It's like, I have evidence that you stole something. I have proof that you stole something.
The weight of credibility.
Okay, which way, who has more?
Proof.
Proof has more credibility. Is this right, or am I taking too much of a liberty with it? Is that, do you feel comfortable in that? Less credible evidence? Like, let's say I find fingerprints, like in a criminal investigation, fingerprints. Are those, is that evidence or is that proof? Evidence, okay, that's good, right? It's evidence. What would make it proof?
Imagining finger.
The imagining finger. Oh, it's right here next to it. Thank you for the disturbing image. What would make it proof? Who wants to give me maybe an example? It might be kind of long. Yeah, go ahead.
With the same fingerprint, it could be evidence that somebody might have caused murder, but it's proof that that person did touch that object.
Okay. It's proof that they touched the object, but evidence that they might commit the murder, right?
Yeah.
So proof is much tighter than evidence, right? And evidence can say a number of different things. The same fingerprint could help us construct a proof on murder. It could help us prove that they touched the window. It could help us confirm their presence. They were actually in that room at some time, right? So what this distinction is, when you think about the difference of this, is it sort of goes against the old phrase that a lot of people tend to believe, which is facts speak for themselves, which is absolutely not true. Facts say many, many, many different things at once. And it's up to you to add something to it to make it tighter than just this, right? So when you go and do research and you're figuring out things about the motions that you might debate, you might get the idea that whatever you found is enough. Right? It's just enough. But it's not enough. You have to add something of yourself, your own mind, your own imagination, your own explanation to it to make it work for you to prove your argument, right? To make your argument solid. So you get a lot of very bad sorts of debate arguments where people say, well, it's just rather obvious that this would lead to this. Oh, we just know it. Look at, we just know that this is bad because okay? The facts speak for themselves. It's so obvious. It's so true. But that's just not the way it works. Right? You have to have a distinguishing between these two things. Because this involves you and your speaking and your presence. And proof is also something that we can offer when the evidence, like in BP, we don't have a lot of very solid evidence. Like in American debate, we're always referring to documents and things like this. It makes them feel a lot more comfortable. Right? But it also hurts their ability to do the very cool thing that BP forces you to do, which is add yourself into it and say, in this context, in this situation, with this argument, this motion, and these opponents, here's what this means. And it can change almost every time. So in the handout, I put the names of two ancient dead Greek guys I really like, Corax and Tisius. And they came up with a way of thinking about this that I thought was very useful for thinking about debate. They were from Syracuse, not Syracuse, New York, but the island of Syracuse, which had tyrants for many hundreds and hundreds of years, very, very long time ago. And then they got rid of their tyrants, they had a revolution, they had democracy. Then they realized they had trouble because in their court system, it was always the tyrant who just decided the law. Like, this is right, that's wrong, and no one ever questioned it. So like, well, how do we decide legal disputes now? So they decided, well, we'll just get a group of citizens together, and they will judge what's right and wrong in any of these cases that come up. So Corax and Tisius were watching this thing happen because people were like, well, how do I prove it? I mean, what is it that I need to do now that there's no tyrant to tell me what's right and wrong? What do? I just tell my friends. I'm just like, well, what would you do? Like, they just started coming up with things. Well, what would you do if somebody stole your chickens? You'd kill them, right? Yeah, all right. And then they would kill them. They'd be like, no, you shouldn't kill me because it's wrong. It doesn't match the quality of that. Do you think it's really worth my life, these 6 chickens? They'd be like, yeah, actually, that's kind of a good idea. So as the years went on, people just kind of were randomly winning these cases. Corax and Tisius were like, maybe there's a system to figuring out how to convince people that you're right and wrong. So they went to the courtroom every day and just watched cases. And they were, after a few years, they were like, okay, cool. We figured it out. We know exactly how to argue to convince anyone who might be your judge how to prove that you're right. And here's what they came up with. People believe that what is probable is likely to happen. Right? But people also believe, at the same time, that what is improbable is also likely to happen. Now that seems contradictory, right? But here's how this works. People hold these views at the same time, even today, right? You think, if I buy a lottery ticket and play the lottery, I'm probably going to lose, right? All the evidence compels me to think this. You're more likely to be struck by lightning than to win the lottery. Right? If I do this, I'm just going to waste you know, a few bucks and not win anything, and maybe have like 2 minutes of entertainment when I think that my number is coming up, and oh, throw it away. Why should I waste my money on this stupid thing? But somebody's got to win. Somebody's got to win, and if I don't play, then I can't win. Somebody's got to win, right? So people hold contradictory views at the same time. And I think it's a very, very good insight for helping you generate arguments. Because you might feel like you are automatically on the losing side of a proposition. We all sort of felt that way. You get assigned a side, and you hear the proposition, and you think, oh my God, there are no good arguments at all for this side of the motion. I wish I was the other side. They have everything going for them. But if you think in terms of probability, these two things can coexist. If you think in terms of just straight facts, or evidence, or just straight reason, and you don't rely on this sort of thinking, then you might run out of the ability to generate some pretty good arguments. Because even though you could say, look, even though their side, it's incredibly probable, it's incredibly realistic, all the evidence seems to point that way, but you know, it's got to happen to somebody. Would you want it to be you? Would you want it to be your family this happens to? Would you want it to be, you know, you sort of draw on those kind of things. Because the judge is human, right? Just like all of us are. And will most likely still continue to hold this, right? This is why certain fields of thought have so much trouble closing the door, right? Like economics, because economics assumes people are rational actors, right? That's one of the fundamental, am I right? I'm not an economist, but I know somebody in here has probably studied it, right? Hopefully, I don't know. Maybe not, maybe I can just say whatever I want and not have to worry about being accurate or right, but.
Who was lectures coming up on economics?
Oh, okay. So you might ask Uwe, right? It's like rational actors is the fundamental unit of how economists make decisions on what people are going to do. But then you attempt to explain brand loyalty or advertisement based on this rational actor model, where when you look around and you ask people, oh, are you influenced by commercials? People are like, no, commercials are stupid. Advertisements are stupid. I don't pay any attention to them. They're silly. They're dumb. But people put millions and millions and millions of dollars into advertisements every day, right? So obviously they're working something. They're just throwing that money away because they don't work, right? So it's a paradox, right? They work, but then they don't. They work in a way that no one will admit to. They work irrationally, right? Same thing with brand loyalty. You've probably felt that yourself. Like if there's a certain brand of something that you've always gotten, maybe your parents always bought it, and so you're like, oh, I need those crackers or whatever. And you see that the store has a brand or there's a cheaper brand that looks exactly the same. You still feel like guilt or some kind of weird feeling. You're like, I don't know if I should buy it, even though it's cheaper. Maybe I should spend the extra couple of dollars and buy the other thing. So it's another thing. It doesn't really work rationally. So you have to keep this human element in mind when you're thinking about how to make persuasive arguments that will persuade or will convince people, is that you're in the world of probability. And if you're in the world of facts and demonstration, you're in a world of solely evidence, right? Like physics. Physics would be a world of solely evidence, where if you say something, they're going to say, prove it. You provide an experiment, you provide the data, that's what you do, right? In the world of pure proof, you're in a world with nothing like that at all. And I can't really think of a good analogy to this, but the best thing I can think of would be when you're discussing sports with your friends, like over lunch or something, where you don't have access to all the statistics, but you're still able to make persuasive arguments just on the fly, right? Somewhere in the middle is where debate lives, right? Somewhere in the middle of the continuum is where debate lives. And I think in the world of probability, that if you go too much in either direction, it's not a good way to generate arguments, right? If you go too much in, you want to try to find a balance in the middle of a good way to generate arguments. If they're going heavy on evidence and you think, oh, our goose is cooked, moving more this way towards the probable, you can say, look, I can twist this around in a way to make it just as persuasive and just as much attention, even if they have sort of the greater weight of the evidence. I can have the greater weight of proof on my side, because I can go with the improbable, or what is likely is what is improbable is just as likely as what is probable. I can think of a way to construct it. It's a generative point for you to think. Did you have something to say, Jens?
I just wanted to add two things, and hoping not precluding anything. But,
no, it's fine.
It's sort of two 30-second remarks, which each of you could write a book on, right? So the one is, it's really interesting if you look at this in modern science theory, right? So for instance, Popper, right? I assume you've all heard of him or read of him, who said it's impossible to prove anything.
That's right.
You can only prove things wrong, but you cannot positively prove something. Not even that Vienna is 200 kilometers away from here. We have good evidence for that, right? It's quite probable. On every map, Vienna is 200 kilometers away, but proof, it's going to be hard to find. And others say, well, that's too high a standard. It's actually enough what we have right now, so we can establish proof. So actually, it's still being debated today. Mm-hmm. And the other thing for you guys may be interesting is, keeping that in mind, that it's really hard to find proof. Probability in debate is absolutely enough. If you're able to establish a good probability that something is going to happen, that usually is going to win you the debate, right? And if then adjudicators judge on probability, they're going to say, yeah, well, both had claims, both were arguing something, but the one side was a little more convincing, and I think that's a bit more probable, so I'm going to give them the point. And therefore they're going to win. So actually, at times you don't need to aim for the standard of proof that you would have in criminal law, where you would have to establish exactly that somebody's guilty, but just saying it's probable, it's enough. This is why we debate, because we don't know for sure. If we knew for sure, we wouldn't have to debate it, right? So I think that's quite helpful to keep that in mind. Otherwise, you can go crazy because you can never actually prove something definitely in a 7-minute speech. I think that's just impossible.
Yeah, I mean, Popper's a good person to keep in mind, especially along with, and doesn't preclude anything, but there's another ancient thinker who was around a little bit later than Craxenticius, and his name might be familiar to you if you studied Plato, but it's Gorgias. Gorgias is one of Plato's hated enemies, right? He wrote a whole book about him making fun of his ideas. It's called Gorgias. And in it, Gorgias kind of is like Bono or something at the beginning of the book. But near the end, you kind of feel like he's a fool. So Gorgias was a professional controversialist. He went around Athens saying, bring me your argument, I'll make it a winner. Just pay me. I'll make it a winner if you're going to court. Because in Athens, they didn't have a professional attorney system like we do in the Western world. Most of the world has a professional attorney system. They didn't have that. You had to go and defend yourself if you're accused of murder or anything. You have to go defend yourself. So what you do is go hire somebody like Gorgias, be like, here's what happened. Write me a good speech. And they write it, and then you memorize it. And it was all about what is probable, right? Because they had they didn't have a very pluralistic society, so it was easy to identify the values of the people who would be judging you, and then appeal to those values. So Gorgias would advertise his services by going around reading poetry, and he had a really beautiful voice, and sounded great. And then at the end of his speeches, he would say, I will stand up here as long as you want and answer any question that you give me, and I'll give you a very convincing answer on any topic at all. Just ask me a question. So people would do this for hours. He'd go on these long, made-up discourses about it, right? Using the principles that his compatriots here, because they're both from the same place. He was from Syracuse too, but he moved to Athens after he saw the court system was like, I can make a lot of money here, right? I think I could really rock the place. So he focused on this. Plato didn't like him because he focused on this, because Plato was one of these people who's more like, proof is almost impossible, right? The way that you would find things out is not through trickery like this, but through searching your soul and finding out exactly what is right. Everyone has the capacity for doing that. You do it one-to-one, and you would do it completely honestly, with no verbal tricks or anything like that. And this guy's much more of a pragmatist. He's like, well, whatever works is, fine. So this goes along with the Popper point that he's making too. Because Gorgias wrote a lot of things, but none of them really survived. We only have a fragment that says 3 of his principles, which are good principles to keep in mind for debate, whether you might believe them or not. They're kind of strange. He said, here are the 3 principles of the universe. 1, nothing exists, right? Because he says, it's impossible to prove anything. Everything's in a world of probability. Nothing exists. Secondly, if something existed, we couldn't know what it was because we're limited from being people. We couldn't know that. That's his second principle. His third principle was, if something existed and we could know what it was, we could never accurately communicate it to one another. And that's where it stops. I guess he didn't feel like there was a fourth. It's just, that's enough, right? So if you think about that, it's a pretty good mindset from the ancient world to take to debate, right? Because it just shows you how impossible it is. If your goal as a debater is, I'm going to speak the truth, or I'm going to speak what is accurate and right, and I'm going to be right all the time, well, then you're probably going to lose a lot of debates, because that sort of thing is a thing that moves you towards, well, it's just right. Can't you just see it? Can't you just know it? Isn't it rather obvious? Instead of, wait a second, maybe I'm probably right. Gives you a bit more wiggle room to say, okay, now, even though nothing exists, and even though I don't know what it is, and even though I can't communicate it, I'm going to try. Because it's the only thing I could possibly do to make people feel like what I'm seeing when I look out the window is what you ought to be seeing too, because I think that means we ought to do something. And here's what I think it is. And that's where debate comes in, that's where rhetoric comes in, as studied by these guys. So if you're interested in Gorgias' ideas, he's pretty accurately depicted in Plato's account. Although Plato is sort of giving him short shrift, because Socrates is in that book too, and Socrates is like Plato's hero, and so Socrates tends to get the better arguments. But that's what happens when you get to write the script, So, but it goes along with what you said about Popper. Popper said the best way to judge any theory was to determine whether it's unfalsifiable, right? Which I don't know if that's the what you're getting out there. But it's like there's certain theories should never be believed because there's no way to determine that they're improbable. they're always true no matter their applicability. Right? So the big theories he goes against are Marxism. Right? Marxism can be applied to any situation, Popper says, and always be right and always be explanatory. There's something fishy if that's the case. That's very fishy if that's the case. And the other one he went after was Freud and psychoanalysis. It's like, you can apply that to anything. And he gives the example of talking to a psychoanalyst to say, you know, I know this 6-year-old boy, he's got this problem, maybe you could see him and tell me. He's like, I can diagnose it now without ever having seen him. I know exactly what's wrong with him. Popper's like, there's something wrong with that. Right, there should be limits. The way of it's sort of an opposite, it's an improbable is likely kind of claim. It's like, if something has limits, it's actually something you ought to believe in more, rather than a theory that's grandiose, universalizing, and can explain everything. Even though our first instinct would be, that's the right explanation. It's actually better to have some limits, is what Popper was saying.
As you could put it, is the problem with these theories is that they are not even wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, right. You can use them for anything, they're always right. A good Marxist can look at anything and be like, I know exactly what's going on here. Right? And then they'll say some version of, the bourgeoisie has duped the proletariat, and they're taking advantage of them. And you'll be like, no, that's not it. These people really want to do this. And then what's their answer? False consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Or something like that. They always have a way of dealing with it, right? There's not a point where a Marxist explanation doesn't work. But the way to evaluate it is to say, well, did it provide any new kind of understanding or deeper understanding or something like that? And if it doesn't, then I think the theory is not very good. That would be the way I would apply Popper's dictum.
It's actually the same with alien abductions.
Oh yeah?
You can use them for anything, or anything that aliens did on Earth. It's not possible to falsify that aliens did it, right? Therefore, it's not a good theory, even though it potentially explains everything. It explains Silvio Berlusconi for sure, but right?
But that's what the aliens would want us to think, man.
Yeah.
Come on.
That's
good.
good Marxist analysis, then. Yeah.
A little conspiracy theory rhetoric never hurt anybody. A conspiracy theory rhetoric, this is actually a good transition to what I want to talk about. Were 6 fallacies that everyone should have memorized that come to us from the ancient world. This is a good one, this alien abduction one in conspiracy theory, because this is the fallacy of an appeal to ignorance fallacy, which is the basic fallacy that all conspiracy theory arguments are based on. An appeal to ignorance is rather, once you master it, it's kind of like chess. It's the opposite of chess. It's kind of difficult to understand the basic rule of it, because you need to know a little bit about some basic assumptions of argument in Western society or Western philosophy. Then once you get it, then you can see it everywhere. It just starts popping up everywhere, and it'll be horrifying to you how many times you've either assented to something that's an appeal to ignorance, or how many times you see people do it every day. So I'm going to need more chalkboard here. So forgive me while I put this on, but no, that's all right. If you can tear the tape, that's what I'm going to try. What were you saying? Go ahead.
Oh,
Say it louder for everyone.
in Boondocks, there's this like conspiracy theorist like ex-soldier, and he says crazy stuff, and the guy's like, you have no proof, and he goes, well, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, and it's just so funny, like,
Yeah, doesn't want to. Well, as long as it stays up for enough time to explain it, we can follow after that. I think I've got it. There we go. Oh, smart man. Beautiful. Thank you. Okay, so here's how an appeal to ignorance works. Now, in basic argumentation theory that comes from philosophy and from people who study rhetoric, we have, in any argument that you have 2 sides, the affirmative and the negative, or what they're called, but we can call them anything, and we call them government and opposition in British Parliament, right? And you could also call them prosecutor and defense in a court system, or plaintiff and defense in a civil proceeding. The names really don't matter, but the principles do. So anytime you're affirmative or government, you have what's called a burden of proof, which means if you want to change someone's mind, you should provide evidence and proof that it's a good idea for them to change their beliefs or actions. The negative doesn't have a burden of proof. They have presumption, which means it's probably not a good idea to change your mind or actions unless you have been convinced that enough evidence exists, right, to change, that you're going to get some advantage out of it, or you're going to fix some problem because of it, right? And this is how it works in court of law, right? The prosecutor should have the burden of proof because you're innocent until proven guilty, right? In a criminal case, that's how it functionally works. It's like, we shouldn't just throw people in jail on suspicion, is the prevailing view of most advanced or even basic legal systems in the world. Right? So now this is a terribly inconvenient thing to have if you're affirmative burden of proof, because it means you need to research, it means you need to think, you have to wake up early, you have to get on the bus and go to the library. It's a pain. Wouldn't it be nice if we could figure out a trick to put this over here and steal this? And that's what the appeal to ignorance does, and that's why it's a fallacy. It flips these rights and responsibilities around, right? So if I say to you that this document that I've handed out to you is actually Holy Scripture, because I was possessed by the God of debate when I wrote this, and it coursed through my veins, and I typed it out, I had no knowledge of it. What would you say to that claim?
Prove it.
Prove it, right? Don says, okay, prove it. Now here's where the appeal comes in. I say, well, prove to me that the God of debate didn't do that.
Prove to me that he exists first.
Well, why should I? Why should I have to?
Because
Why don't you
he's
prove to me that he doesn't exist? Go. I'm ready to hear your arguments.
not prove the existence of something that's not there.
Okay, so you can see how this, what I'm trying to do is like totally flip and steal and get out of my responsibility, which is why it's bad. So it's basically the way I've typed it out in here. Absence of evidence is not support for an argument. So if you say prove it and the person says, prove to me that it's not the case, and you're like, well, I don't know, and then they're like, haha, you see? You can't prove the opposite. So that means I'm right. Well, I've just taken a void and I've used it to stand on. I've decided to stand on emptiness. And we know what happens when that happens. You fall, right? So you got to watch out for this. And this will sometimes come up in a point. It'll sometimes even be the entire philosophy of a government or opposition argument. And you can be like, where is your proof for that? What are you standing on, right? And the way that you explain this appeal to ignorance and why we shouldn't assent to it is because we should never assent to something that we don't have any explanation beyond itself for. Right? You should never assent to something if we're going to change something that there's no explanation or support for at all. So the appeal to ignorance is everywhere. One time I was actually teaching this idea and it came up in the class. So I was teaching and I was talking about there were these fires. No, what was it? Okay, no, there was a hurricane that was about to hit Florida. And this television evangelist, Pat Robertson, you might know who that is. I don't know if he's a big-time television evangelist. He has a daily television show where he's like, send me money so I can help God purify the evil from the United States. Right? And then people send in their prayer requests, and he reads them and puts his hand on them like this, and he prays to God. And then he's like, so I'm sure they're already feeling better at home, right? Or this kind of thing. So he was like, pray with me, or the hurricane was about to hit, Florida, and it was really going to be devastating. He was like, pray with me, put your hands on the television and pray with me. The hurricane will. And he put his hands up, and people were supposed to go up and touch the TV. And this power was going to turn the hurricane away. So he's like, did it, and then the hurricane turned away. And it went and hit like South Carolina and destroyed that instead. So instead of Florida, right? This was several years ago. I don't know if you remember this. I think it was like, I forget the name of the hurricane, but Pat Robertson was like, this proves that God is alive and well working in our lives. And I said, now, I was teaching something else. I said, now, is this really enough proof? I mean, there's a lot of other explanations as to why the hurricane moved, and they're probably more reasonable. And I started listening to them, and the student was like, I was like, yes? He's like, prove to me that the prayer didn't turn the hurricane on. Right? So you can see, appeal to ignorance. It's easy to fall into and easy to do. And you usually just end up at a standoff, right? If you pursue that sort of thing. Okay, the next one everyone should know, and you should always keep these fallacies in mind, memorize these. Appeal to authority. Just because someone's in authority, it doesn't mean what they say is correct. Now sometimes, this is a very difficult, it seems like an easy one to get, but it's very difficult to master. Because sometimes someone's position of authority means that we ought to listen to them in a different way. Right? So don't confuse it. Just because George Bush happens to be the President of the United States, it doesn't make him an expert on things. But it makes his words valuable in a way that they wouldn't be if he wasn't President. Right? So don't just think it's an appeal to authority just because if their argument is, well, the President has said the United States is going to support X action, be like, oh, appeal to authority, he doesn't know anything. Well, he might not know anything, but his words still have a lot more power than mine do. Right? Because if he says we should march into Iraq, it actually happens. Whereas if I say we should march into Iraq, it doesn't. Right? Or if I should say we should march somewhere else, nothing happens. Right? If I declare it, nothing happens. Right? So be careful about that. Appeal to authority means just because someone's in power doesn't mean we should listen to them as an expert. Right? You ought to press and figure out why we should listen to that person as an expert. Why should we? There are a number of different people who have advanced degrees who are not worth listening to. Right? And they are published and they're everywhere. You're going to figure out, are they really an authority? Are they really a person that we want to listen to? And why would we want to listen to that person above other ones? Okay, number 3 is my favorite one. Because it's a causal fallacy, and I absolutely love talking about causation because it's so hilarious, some of the things that people will actually believe. Post hoc ergo propter hoc, which is Latin for I'm smarter than you. Anytime you use a Latin phrase, it generally means that, right? It's like, whoa, ethos, right? Credibility out the wazoo. So, post hoc ergo propter hoc means two concurrent events are not necessarily the causes of each other. If two things exist simultaneously, right? Now, let me do this in a sort of a formal logical way. Let's say that we know that X yields Y, and we know that. That's something that we learned in school, let's say. And we look around, and we see X and Y sitting around in the universe. What can we conclude?
They exist.
Yeah, pretty much. But most people would say, well, obviously, X caused Y. Now, for a logician, this isn't quite tight enough, right? Because we need to know that only X causes Y in order to assent. But to the debater, we'd say, well, probably X caused Y. It's probably the case, but that doesn't mean it's absolutely the case. You can always destroy one of these arguments by saying, are we sure that X is the sole cause of Y? Right? So when people say depressions lead to wars, right, which is a pretty common standard argument, we wouldn't want to get into depression because it leads to war. You can interrogate that. You'd be like, is the Great Depression the sole cause of World War II, or were there other factors involved, right? Is this the exact cause of this? Like, all kinds of things. Things in the world are so incredibly complicated, there's usually another way to attribute the cause besides just one. And if someone wants to prove sole cause, they really have a difficult task ahead of them. Because it's so easy to poke holes in that, it's so easy to just to interrupt that, and it's so easy to say other things could have caused it. We know that X causes Y in this example, but we don't know if Z causes Y or other things cause Y as well. So you can always use that as a point of argumentation on causal arguments. And a post hoc is just because two things exist, it means that one caused the other, right? So this is the basis of all sorts of superstition, right? Like, I wear this shirt every time I teach this lecture, and this lecture has been awesome, so I'm never washing this shirt. I'm always going to wear it, and if I don't have it, then the lecture is going to suck. It's like sports teams do. I'm not shaving until we win the big game, right? Or like what happens generally is like you're not going to wash your lucky shirt for the soccer game or whatever, and then your mom finds it. It's like, oh, it's this stinky thing. Washes it. Oh, we're going to lose, right? Or like a black cat crosses your path and you have a bad day. So you assume that's going to always be the case. So coexistence is not causation, right? And you want to always keep that one in mind because you will be easily swayed if it makes a bit of sense, probable sense. If you hear the government or opposition say something like that, the very first thing in your mind is like, only unique cause of this problem? I don't think so. And you can generate a number of arguments right away just by keeping post hoc in your head. Okay? A circular argument, which we had a couple of times earlier when we were doing this, right? You have to have external support for a premise to be true. A premise cannot support itself. Right? So proof is what proves something. Would be circular. I don't learn anything. There's nothing external holding that up. We just kind of get chased in a circle. You need something external to prove something true in a circular argument. So circular reasoning is it is because it is because it is. It's where you use the premise to support itself. You have to have some external thing to prove it true. So if you keep that one in mind, you'll find a lot of people are proving their arguments or their claims just by repeating the claim in a different way. You want to be on top of that and really point that out. And judges will reward you for this kind of thing. Like, for me, I don't know about Jens and what you think about the judging, but I really like it when people point out these sorts of reasoning things. I find those to be really great arguments and really, really powerful things, and I really like it. And I think judges are willing to reward you if you can point out, some loose thinking, right? Begging the question is where you assume a controversial issue has already been settled, and then you base your argument on it, right? So you're like, abortion should obviously be outlawed because murder is outlawed. Thank you very much. Right? Whereas there's still a bit of a controversy among people on both sides of the debate as to where the point of life begins. Right? Which is actually the centerpiece of the pro-choice movement in the United States of their argument as to why abortion should be legal, is we're not certain of the rights of this unborn person trump the rights of a mother or a person who's actually a citizen. Is this person a citizen or a human being or whatever? So begging the question always assumes that the more important question has already been answered, whether this thing is wrong or not. So you can develop a whole opposition strategy based on this, right? So the government case, if you have a motion that's a bit open, the government case might assume that that open motion has already been decided in one way or another, right? You can, as your contribution to debate is opposition, bring up the question that is begged. Is this actually wrong or right? You know, they have a great case or a great plan or whatever, but the larger question remains. They have assumed that it should be answered in this direction without investigating it at all. We're going to investigate it, and that's why you're going to oppose today. And it's a really great way of doing it, right? You'd be like, I would say that the set of all of the things they're talking about is wrong, right? That kind of thing. You can point out that there's some question begging going on. And the last one is the loaded question. A question that either way you answer it, the answer indicts you. Right? So, Peter, I'll pick on you. Peter, when have you, here's a good loaded question. Peter, have you stopped beating up your girlfriend?
No.
So you're still doing it, okay. So, you know, you think of that as a loaded question is a question no matter which way you answer it, it's bad. You're going to look bad, right? So that actually comes from an actual court case. It's like, have you stopped beating your wife? Was the first on a cross-examination of a guy. It's like, so have you stopped beating your wife? He's like, no, yes, no, yeah. You know, it's either way you're agreeing to, right? And so questions should be honestly asked, right? So sometimes you'll get a point like this, where either way you answer the point, it's going to make you look foolish, right? Or that it's a bad argument. And people do this all the time, and it's kind of like, it's very frustrating. But either way you deal with it, if you answer it yes or no, or you say, I'm going to get to that later, and then you never do, or you sort of sigh in exasperation, it's going to look bad to the judge. The best way to handle it is be like, sir, that question is loaded. Either way I answer it, it's going to be bad. I'd like to focus more on these issues rather than some kind of a trick question where no matter what I say, it's going to make us look bad. We're going to move on, right? So you want to point out how it's loaded, why it's loaded, how it's sort of a trick question, right? And that's a good way of handling this kind of thing. So,
but you're going to win debates this way, right? If you're able to use them as a POI, it's going to kill the other team pretty much straight away.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's sort of the question that people ask about these things. It's like, well, if you teach this kind of bad reasoning, can't people use these things in the debates themselves? And sometimes I think you can to make a point, right? Sometimes begging the question or loaded question. I mean, people who work on fallacies, there's a large group of people who study nothing but fallacies. They're called the Canadian School of Argument Theory, and they're at the University of Windsor. And the Canadians basically study, the Canadian argument theorists study fallacies. Big questions, like how do you know the difference between a fallacy and a bad argument? Right? How do you know the difference? They study this. They write huge books on some of the ones that I didn't put on here, like ad hominem. An ad hominem is where you attack a person instead of an argument. This guy Douglas Walton, who's a professor up there, has written this huge book just called Ad hominem, where he's tried to categorize all the different flavors of ad hominem, all the different subtypes and everything like this. He also came up with a fallacy that I didn't put on here, which is one that comes up a lot of times in debate that I actually should teach you, which is called, what's the name? Shoot, it says I didn't plan it out, but I forget what it is. Oh, sunk costs. That's what it's called. And this is one that he's trying to develop as a fallacy. He's trying to ask the question, is this a fallacy or not? Like, all these fallacies would be considered bad reasoning and things you shouldn't do ethically, right? But it's up to you to sort of make the decision. It's sort of like I give you the power of the Force. You can choose to be dark side, or light side, whatever you want. You can be with Luke, and Obi-Wan, and all the cool people. You can be Darth Vader, and all those guys, if you want to do the other. So, Walton is trying to figure out whether this is a fallacy. Here's what it sounds like. The sunk cost fallacy says, well, although our highway improvement project is way behind schedule, it's actually made the highway not a better place. Then we've spent millions and millions and millions of dollars over budget on it. We probably should just still go ahead and work on it. Because we put so much into it, even though it's not working, we should put so much into it, we might as well see it through. Right, sunk costs. This would also be like President Bush's rhetoric on Iraq, right? We can't pull out now. We've done so much. We've worked so hard. What does it say to the families of the dead soldiers if we quit now? And whether this is fallacious or not spins on the question of, well, actually, that might be a bad way of thinking in general structurally, because sometimes it's better to cut your losses, right? You spend a huge amount of money on a project, it's not working. The reasonable person says, well, I'm going to stop doing this, right? It's like, you know, if somebody every day comes to your door and is like, hey, give me $20 and I'll give you like $1,000 at the end of the week. You're like, okay. And you keep doing it. You're like, well, if you put so much money into it, I might as well keep going. It's like the way pyramid schemes operate. You know, like Amway and things like that, where they're like, oh, if you send $1 to these people, you'll get all this money back, or, you know, you get your friends involved in it, all this kind of thing. Works the same way. It's a sunk cost fallacy. So he's trying to determine whether this is a fallacy or not, because sometimes it does make sense to keep going, but others not. But the reason I think it's a fallacy is because just because we put a lot into something doesn't mean we should keep doing it. Structurally, right? That's the way I distinguish. Structurally, there's something wrong with all these arguments. They look like arguments and sound like arguments, but they are the type of thinking you wouldn't want to endorse. Because if we endorse that kind of thinking every time, in every case, we would make a lot of bad decisions. And that's one of the ways of thinking about fallacies, right? So, okay, syllogisms and enthymemes are two different kinds of formal reasoning that we'll talk about pretty quickly here. Because you probably all covered this already in school. I'm bringing back some bad nightmares of your secondary educational experience. But a syllogism was the basic formal argument that all logicians still adhere to as being the way arguments should be structured, which is with a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. All military actions kill people. They propose a military action. They kill people. Right? Now, this way of reasoning makes you sound rather robotic. It's really, in debate, it's really just a good way of coming up with ideas to make sure you have a warrant in there, to make sure that they make sense. Like your explanation, just like the basic structure. Sometimes, without doing syllogistic sort of thinking about how an argument works, you might just make the claim and the implication and forget to explain it at all. Or, you might make a claim, explain it, and forget to give any proof or implication. Be like, oh, we're so right, we have this thing. You know, it's gonna help with diversity. Hooray! All right, moving on. And you're like, what's diversity? How do I know you're gonna help with diversity? Why is diversity desirable? Why does it, even if all these things were true, why should I give you the debate on this? I don't understand it. I'm not going to do all that work for you because they don't pay me enough for those debates to do a whole bunch of work for you for your arguments, right? So one of the other ways of reasoning that makes this syllogism, now if you argued like a syllogism, people would think you were a robot, right? Because you'd be like, all plans that have these elements in them will help with diversity. Our plan has these elements in them, therefore it will help with diversity. Anything that supports diversity in society is to be desired. Our plan supports diversity in society, therefore it is to be desired. All plans, and they'll be like, what are you doing? You sound like a calculator. If a calculator could speak. So a syllogism was the way of reasoning that was incredibly formal, the only way of reasoning that was considered valid. Aristotle comes along and he says, well, syllogisms work perfectly fine for philosophical dispute. But when you're dealing with rhetoric, when you're dealing with the probable, when you're dealing with the everyday and the average person, and the court case, we're only in the world of probability, so we don't need this kind of precision. So he proposed the enthymeme, which is leave a premise out and let the audience complete the premise for you, which is the example I have on the bottom. They suggest a military action, which we aren't sure will work, but we are certain about one thing. It will kill people. Right? So that's a much more rhetorically pleasing way to do the same thing. You leave something out, right? You leave something out. You leave one of these premises out. You could say, we all know what happens when the military is called out to go. We all know what's going to happen. And you sort of leave it to them to conclude the argument for you. And Aristotle says this is a very effective way of reasoning because not only now, I mean, you've changed the game around. The audience, before you made the enthymeme, was sort of maybe a little bit against you. Maybe they were just listening to you as a third party and you're trying to persuade them. But now, they're actually with you. They're co-constructing your arguments with you. They're filling things in for you. Oh, he must mean this, or she must mean this. And that's much more effective because I can make an argument, go around the table, and say, okay, why was that effective? And each one of you would say something different, probably. That way, everybody who you're trying to persuade adds in what they already believe. Right? They're like, oh, well, a reasonable person would have to add this in there to make that argument wrong. And that's why it's effective. And you see this used all the time in bad ways. We'll be like, well, we must fight the terrorists because we are defending freedom. And everyone says, freedom is good. Right? But my understanding of what freedom is, I'm pretty sure, is very, very different from what President Bush understands freedom to mean. Right? And very, very different from probably what you understand freedom to mean. And we don't work that out. Right? So they can be dangerous. They can lead to basically question begging, which was the fallacy that you should identify there, which is, we are supporting freedom. The question that's begged is, what is freedom? Right? What does that mean? So, enthymemes can be dangerous, but they're very good because they have the audience working with you. Okay.
If you take the example from the debate today, try to find out what equality actually is. Right? Does it mean everybody has to be equal? Does it mean everybody has to get equal chances? Does it mean that before the law everybody should be equal? Right? So again, it's a loaded concept, just like freedom, where everybody sort of then puts in something. And this is why these debates can go horribly wrong, because nobody spells out what it actually means, and so you're operating on different concepts.
Right.
And that's obviously not going to make a good debate. Therefore, you need to explain more what you mean, and not just stick sort of with the abstract, whatever token is on there, but try to explain what you want to say by using the concept like equality or freedom or liberty or whatever, or the market for that matter.
Yeah, equality or the market can be an excellent claim,
Oh, yeah.
but it needs explanation, proof that your explanation is the best way to understand equality, and then an implication. Why would I not want to support things that are unequal? I mean, I kind of like the idea of being paid more because I do a better job than someone else in my field. Why should I support equality, right? Like, I kind of like if I spend more on a dinner that it would taste better than if I like go to McDonald's or something, right? I kind of like that inequality, so you have to be very careful. I think it's a very good point. So the rest of this are some exercises and things that come from the classical world. An exercise and an organizational strategy of things you can do when you don't want to have a practice debate. So we're moving into sort of the Roman world now. Quintilian was a Roman thinker, and he proposed a way of training Roman lawyers through doing these 7 different exercises. And there are different speeches that you can do that can support or enhance or focus on different things that make you better. And I'll just kind of very quickly go through these things, because I'm pretty sure we're running out of time. I don't know how much time we have left. Does anybody know? Oh, so we are out of time.
It's 4 positive. It's the 2
2 plus 4. Okay, very quickly, what each of these things do, these speeches, are different exercises. They help you work on things like describing in great detail and not leaving any assumptions. Working on identifying those values that you think people who are judging you are going to adhere to, and explaining what you mean by them, like freedom and equality, things like that. Right? On the back, if you're looking for a way to organize speeches, especially opposition, Cicero says all legal defense speeches should be organized this way, with these steps. Right? And that can be a really good way of sort of doing it. So you can use that. You can talk to me about it later if you have questions. That was pretty much what I wanted to share with you. I hope you found it interesting. And now it's time to go to your next elective. I'm sorry I went over time, but I'm willing to chat about this if you have any other questions or want to go into it further. Thank you very much. And